Ryokokui's Delicious in Dungeon pokes fun at fantasy games and cooking manga tropes, exploring what it would be like to be a character in a fantasy game, arranging your life in ways that wouldn't really make sense in the real world. This week, Kumar and Emmet do a deep dive on this consistently enjoyable and beautifully plotted manga, the anime for which is now on Netflix. First, don't forget to take our listener survey to let us know what we're doing right or wrong as we put this show together and choose our topics. Recently, I've shortened the questionnaire somewhat, but you should still allow 5 to 10 minutes to finish it. The link is in the show notes.
This is Kumar.
This is Emmet.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Kumar and Emmet in Melbourne in the outskirts, or way outskirts, I should say.
I know, actually, as we speak, I'm getting hints of fire on the air coming down from the Grampians. Because it's a very hot day, and there's a fire alert out here, and all sorts of signs on the road. I don't think it's anywhere near me right now, but I can smell it in the air. There's definitely something happening.
I heard that fire was predicted, and then it happened.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Just like I predicted my internet would drop out, and then it dropped out, because it always does.
The heat.
When it's over 35. So that's what we had going on over the last 2 days.
Australia. What a fun place to live.
Yeah. We both chosen to be here. Okay, so this week we're talking about Delicious in Dungeon. Now, this was your choice. I have not heard of this before. Mm-hmm. So how did you come into it?
Right. So Delicious in Dungeon, or Dungeon Meshi, as I think it's like popularly known by fans. I suggested we talk about it because it has just been released on Netflix as an animated adaptation.
Right.
So I figured that would be a good sort of, in terms some people out there might understand, this is a good SEO opportunity.
Right.
But with Ryoko Key, I think I happened upon it after I loved Dorohedoro so much. Mm-hmm. And I was looking for something else. And it's interesting that I landed on this, because I feel like they're both very concerned with food and the consumption of food.
Yeah. I even have a slight suspicion that Ryoko Kui might be a pseudonym, because Kui sometimes means to eat.
Right. Okay.
So maybe, I don't know. Maybe it's just a coincidence.
Yeah. But I also have, and as I've mentioned on this podcast a couple of times, the last few years I've become rapidly now enmeshed in the sort of Dungeons and Dragons role-playing culture as well. And this is top to bottom, steeped in all that stuff, So I do wonder if maybe somebody had suggested to me, I mean, I don't have a clear memory, but I seem to recall like a list of, if you like D&D, you would like, and Delicious in Dungeon would be right up there. But this is a book that I buy for other people. Like the first volume, I've given it to 2 or 3 other people to date. And it's one that I will continue to gift out to people, because I think it's a great series, great premise for a series. I really enjoyed it. I just got the latest volume a few weeks ago. I think that's around the time when I reached out to you as well. And it's building up to this epic conclusion. I won't spoil any of that stuff, because I think we're going to stick to the early chapters. But I can't think of another book that's just hooked me from the jump and has been consistently hitting those beats.
Yeah.
Like just all the way along as I've read it, I've just found it to be consistently enjoyable and tight and beautifully plotted. And I want to maybe talk to you about why I think that is in a bit. But that's my impression of it, just overall. I think it's a fantastic series.
Yeah. So when I started reading it a week ago or whatever, when I got to the beginning chapters, I was amazed at how quickly the premise is established. Within 10 pages probably, they explain what the series is going to be about. And my heart sank a little bit because it starts out, you're in a dungeon manga. Now, we have this thing now, these isekai manga, and I'm translating probably 5 or 6 different series, which are all it's just, you're in a dungeon, and there's one, you got an angle. For example, I got transported to the other world, but my mom's stats are higher than mine. Or I got transported to the other world, and now I'm a vending machine. Or these are like actual titles of series. Right. And there's hundreds of them.
I'm stuck translating. The titles?
Those are literally the titles.
Those are literally the titles.
Yeah. Okay. And so I was like, oh no, this is going to be something like that. And it shifted. Now, also when it shifted, so it's actually not steeped in stats and leveling up. There's none of that kind of talk, which there is in all those isekai series, because usually people have been transported into the world of a video game or something like that in those series. It's not like that, but then it becomes a cooking manga, which is another hugely popular genre, of which there are many titles out there. I'm not that interested in food. None of these things actually mattered reading this series. You can actually kind of blaze past the recipes, because the recipes, hilariously, are very detailed but don't matter, because they're not recipes you can make.
Yeah, but I mean, a moment ago you said there's no stats. The food.
Oh, there are. The food has stats. Food has stats. Yes, the food has the little like septagon
the
diagram.
Protein breakdown. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's right. So surprising, and I did think there were like the plot really, despite establishing the premise right out of the gate, it changes a lot. Now I read the first 4 volumes, and I was surprised by the shifts. But we should maybe describe the premise first so that we can talk about those shifts. So
sure.
We're living in a dungeon world, like a role-playing fantasy world.
Yes.
I shouldn't say role-playing, it's fantasy world. And there's a party that goes into a dungeon. They're fighting a red dragon, a huge red dragon. This is in the opening pages. But they're struggling with the fight because they're hungry. They've lost some food coming down here, and they had some accidents, and some of their provisions were lost, etc. So they're fighting on empty stomachs, which quite possibly leads them to be losing this fight. And one of the main characters, the warrior, the fighter type, let's say, his name is Laos.
Laos.
Yeah. His sister is eaten by the dragon. And they're teleported out of there. And the sister isn't teleported out. She's in the stomach of the dragon.
Yep.
So then it's like, okay, we have to go back and rescue her. And meanwhile, there's another kind of sub-premise to the series, which is that this dungeon was like built on top of some ancient city, and the king of that city had been like entrapped there by what they call a lunatic wizard, I think is how they refer to him.
Yep.
A few times. And he comes out of this, the dungeon is accidentally discovered in this village, and he comes out and he says, if anyone kills the lunatic wizard, they can have my kingdom. So, but that's kind of mostly in the background in these early volumes. You don't hear much about that subplot of it. But basically, Laos wants to go down there. Laos wants to go down there and rescue his sister, but they don't have money, and they don't have much supply. So his thing is, he's obsessed with like details about monsters. He's like a monster nerd, and the thing he hasn't done is taste them. He's interested in what they taste like. So his thing is, we can kill and eat these monsters as we're traveling through the dungeon, and that's how we can survive without having to carry or buy provisions going into the dungeon. So the whole thing is, the first, I'd say first 2 volumes, every chapter is like they kill a monster, and then they cook the monster, and then they eat the monster, and then we get the stats, we get the recipe, the final panel. When the food is completely cooked, we get the recipe and a little diagram with all the like protein or nutrition chart, that kind of thing, as well. And that's kind of it. Now, did you want to add anything onto this?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add a couple of things. Number one, I mean, the main character's name trips me up every time because I keep thinking it's Laois, which is a county in Ireland. Because it's almost spelled the same, but it's no, it's Laos.
Laos. Yeah.
Laos, because they actually in the anime, they actually say the name.
Yes.
I say, oh, thank you. That was tripping me up. So it's his sister Fallon who gets eaten by the red dragon, and that's the sort of emotional core, and we need to rescue the sister. And the party effectively breaks up at that point, because they've suffered a loss, and the only members of the party who stick with Laos are Marcel and Chilchuk, and Marcel is like a mage, and Chilchuk's a rogue, and the rest of the party leave them. And then they happen upon this dwarf barbarian who isn't a barbarian. He's a chef. And that's very important because he looks like a barbarian. He's got an axe. And he even has... have you got to the bit about his cooking bowl yet?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, right. So he's got this bowl, and there's a whole reveal about what the bowl actually is. So it's this sort of stereotype of what a dwarf berserker should be. And then he's not that. He's a chef, and he actually has knowledge of cooking monsters, and he facilitates and enables Laos's obsession with eating monsters. So there's a perversity at work here too.
Yeah, and it plays off against Marcel because she's horrified at the thought of eating these monsters. Yeah,
and Chilchuk just wants to get paid.
Yeah.
So he's on because he's waiting for the score. So the dynamics are established there right away. And I really enjoyed that. Now, you corrected yourself when you said it's a role-playing world, and then you were like, no, it's a fantasy world. Yeah. But the way they talk about
it is a role-playing world. Yes.
It is a role-playing world.
Yes, because we have the warrior, we have the mage, the rogue. That's enough to go through the.
They talk about their roles. They talk about their classes, and then they talk about going back to base to recover your food, your spend money on armor, spend money on weapons. They're talking about it in these terms, and what actually is happening here is Ryoko is exposing the ludonarrative dissonance of role-playing games, which is that you are playing as these characters in these fantasy worlds, but you will then stop in the middle of an urgent quest to go back to camp so you can get your sleep and get your spell slots back. That's actually, she's drawing attention to the fact that actually makes no sense. So Laos's idea is, I'm going to keep harvesting creatures within the dungeon, and that will be our source of sustenance. And in fact, in the Dungeons and Dragons community, there are now these homebrew guides. I think one's called Kibblesmith's Guide. And what homebrew, the concept of homebrew is, it's not officially published. It's something that a person within the community has produced and gets community support. People say, oh, that's a good idea. I would like to sign up for that. There are now homebrew guides to eating and crafting monsters from within these worlds, these dungeons. Right. So I feel like these things are parallel tracks. Yeah. What I am fascinated by with Dungeon Meshi is, here's a creator who's exploring, well, what would this really be like? And that's kind of at the core of all of this.
Yeah, and I actually think there were some things that were, I would say, upended. I was expecting it to be pure tropes except for the cooking of monsters. But then we hear what Chilchuk's, he's the rogue, we hear that his race, his species, he's called a half-foot. And Laos is a tall man. And those aren't Dungeons and Dragons. I've never heard those terms before. And then we get to the Red Dragon, and she's actually worked out a lot of details about this Red Dragon, like how the fire breathing works, and that it has this tongue-clicking thing. And there's actually a lot of fantasy work. I was expecting that none of that stuff was... I was expecting another isekai where all that stuff was just, quote-unquote, by the book. Almost literally by the Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Handbook or whatever. But it's not. She's actually really... And she's worked out a kind of ecosystem of the way the food chain is working in this dungeon. All this kind of stuff. And all these... Besides the food stuff, all the other fantasy stuff, she's actually worked out quite a bit of stuff. It's like a real, which is why, especially after the first 2 volumes, which are, I thought, oh, this premise is not sustainable, I thought, because it's every chapter we're going to kill the thing and then cook the thing, and here's how we prepare it. And I was like, how long is this going to go on for? But by volume 3, and especially by volume 4, it had turned into a fantasy world where it didn't matter if you didn't care about the food stuff, which was the least interesting part of it to me. And also,
it's my favorite. It's my favorite part. I love it. I absolutely love it.
Yeah.
But carry on. Sorry.
But you cook, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's all that. Like, I don't cook. I don't really. I'm the kind of guy that if I could get a sustenance pill or like a IV nutrition drip, I would take that over having to eat a meal. So I was like, whatever. But I mean, it works. It's really funny as kind of a parody of those food manga that you see all the time. But after like 15 chapters, I was like, how can this go on? And then suddenly all this interesting stuff, all the fantasy world stuff, started getting fleshed out in its own way. It wasn't, like I said, all the cliches. It was like interesting things started to happen. And I also thought, how long is this plot going to go on for, where they're looking for the sister? You know, is this... Because I looked, I think there's 14 volumes so far or something. I was like, is this really going on this long? And actually, plot starts to change and develop. Which surprised me. I was really taken aback. Also, the artwork, which is great starting out, but it really improves. Like, she really captures... She's got such a gift with the faces, like the facial expressions, especially of Marcel and Chilchuk. And getting there... Because they're, I guess, the most exasperated or disgusted more often than the other characters. Maybe that's why. But that really improved as well. And it was getting... You know, I was getting deeper and deeper into it. And that was only like 4 volumes in.
The phrase I came up with it was factical world building.
Okay.
So world building is typically like somebody comes up with that. Well, this is the history of the land, and these are the peoples and the races and the monsters that live in this land. And now I'm going to have my plot set within this world. And I feel what's happening here is instead you've got... what are the physics of this world? What's the sensorium of this world? What kind of smells and scents and tastes come with living in this world? What's the culture of this world? And so she's actually created the self-contained concept of the dungeon within the world as well. Because then we start learning all things about, how death happens in the dungeon.
That was
different.
A key. Yeah, that was a really key thing for me. Because when we learned that adventurers in the dungeon can just get resurrected, I was like, well, so what are the stakes? I was like,
exactly.
It's
like a gamer. It's like a gamer. Like the gamer will just like, I'm just going to walk into this dungeon, see what happens. You die, and you go, oh, that's okay.
And
I'll
then
come back.
You respawn somewhere. I was like, what is the point of this? But then, especially volume 3 and 4, again, we got a lot of build up that there are all sorts of conditions and rules around this, and they're very interesting, and they affect the way the plot can develop. Because of those rules. So actually, you think you're getting one thing, consistently in the series, you think you're getting one thing, and then it starts to develop into something else. I almost wonder if she maybe pitched it to the editors as a parody of cooking manga, and then slid this plot stuff in, like that she really wanted to in the first place, maybe.
She's a big gamer. Like, she's big into her Baldur's Gate games, which is a big thing now, because Baldur's Gate 3 is out. It's from a different studio, so she was into the BioWare Baldur's Gate games, and she's done like character profiles of the cast from Baldur's Gate 2, I believe, and a lot of those games have this reputation for being hyper detailed. Like you can your roleplay experience is founded on the fact that you can read all the books. You can learn all these things by reading all the books, or you can eat all the foods. You can drink all the drinks. You can talk to all the people, and they'll all have their own story, and they'll all have their own history, and you can engage with them on that level. And I think, and then between the games, certain characters survive, so they have histories now, going over hundreds of years, and I think she's tapping into that concept of. I mean, I've used the phrase already, the ludonarrative dissonance, but I think for me, that's where the person playing understands the rules and how to break them in order to play the game, but then not disturb their role-playing fantasy experience. They're the story that they're interested in. Meanwhile, they're like save scumming, like they're dying, they come back. They sell all their junk to get gold. They could buy a magic sword to go back into the dungeon. All these sort of strange things you do that you don't really think about because it's in service of the game. But if you were in that world, you're behaving like a psychopath.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another series of video games I'm really fond of is a video series. I've actually interviewed comic creators who've done spin-offs of the game series Dragon Age. In Dragon Age, there's a setting where you climb up to the top of this building, and you have to go down all these stairs, go back up these stairs to get up and down the building. And eventually I decided, just jump off the top of the building. And when I did that, I landed, and you don't get hurt.
Okay.
Right? So and I was like, oh, cool. All right, I'll just do that from now on. And then I think I saw some cartoon on Reddit. Everybody does this. Everybody does this. And the immediate thought you have is, within this game world, what does that look like? Because this person's just walks off. And I feel that's a key to what this comic series is all about. It's exploring that unreality of this setup. I mean, the dungeon, the more we learn about the dungeon, the fact that there's this one person who's controlling it, in effect, and he's set these rules of conduct, like a dungeon master, that suggests that none of this is real. Like, it's a simulated, controlled environment. And all these adventurers, they're learning the rules and just know how to break them. The other, a much less successful version of this is Ernest Cline's book Ready Player One. Atrocious book, terrible book, made into a mediocre movie by Steven Spielberg. But I remember reading it thinking, this is your fantasy because you just want to be right all the time.
Right.
Whereas I think this is the opposite. This is Ryoko Kei's fantasy because she wants to live here. This actually is enjoyable. This is a true immersion.
Yeah.
That's the pleasure. And I think it's the pleasure for the reader as well. And I really think food is such a great entry point. Because you know the immediacy of taste and how that can affect your whole way of being for a day.
As much as
what a good meal can do for you.
Yeah, I didn't connect with the food stuff, but reading it, I immediately saw that there were going to be readers who had memorized the stats and recipes for each of those creatures in the dungeon. There would be a type of reader that would latch onto that completely.
I believe there's a cookbook. I believe there's a cookbook.
Right, okay.
As you said, these are fantasy recipes because, giant parasites don't exist that we can cook into a recipe. That's a true thing that happens in this comic book. But by the same token, the actual approach to the recipe scans as, I think that's a genuine recipe. That could work.
Right. And it feels that way because panel by panel we get all the cooking, all the preparation. It's all very detailed. Yeah. So
you could just substitute the dragon meat, say, with goose meat, and you pretty much have a good meal.
Right.
So I think that's what she's doing as well. Like, it's just that idea of food and breaking it down to stats, which is just a beautiful video game logic to cite here, immediately locates you in that fantasy. And the fact that, as you said at the beginning, they probably lost to the Red Dragon because they were hungry and demoralized, and that's why Fallon got eaten. That's that exact immediately you understand. Oh yeah, you're suboptimal when you're not full. You haven't had a good meal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Coming up, what's the deal with this manga's title? The stellar plotting of Delicious in Dungeon, and more. But first, join us for 20th Century TV and music trivia quiz videos and more on our Patreon page. Patrons donating $4 a month or more get access to hours of additional podcasts, including our current series on Jim Starlin's Captain Marvel work. Get all the info at patreon.com/deconcomics.
Hey there, Bat fans. It's JB in New Orleans, your host of Bat 77, the 70s Batman podcast. I am a child of the 1970s and a lifelong Batman fan. And each month, I summarize and review a randomly picked Batman comic story published in the 1970s. From the pages of Detective Comics, Batman, The Brave and the Bold, and World's Finest. I also read from the letters pages and highlight all the memorable ads from the comics. On past episodes, I have also discussed Batman's appearances on Saturday morning television and the Power Records audio adventures. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you stream or download your favorite podcasts. Or you can find me on the web at bat77podcast.libsyn.com.
I also like that when the sister is killed and they're assuming she's in the stomach of the dragon, they are like, but the dragon will be in hibernation, they're assuming. So they put a 1 month countdown timer on it. I thought that was genius as well. That's such a smart thing to put a countdown timer in there right off the bat. Really smart. I loved all the details about like the life cycles of mimics and things. Again, I was latching on to all the fantasy stuff somehow, which I didn't think would be there. In fact, even giving it I don't know who chose to title this Delicious in Dungeon in English, because the Japanese title, Dungeon Meshi, just means like dungeon meals. That's right, yeah. It's a very bland title. But to give it a kind of isekai, that crazy title, which doesn't even really make any sense, Delicious in Dungeon was like, even the publisher Yen Press, we should mention, very good translation by Taylor Engel. I've never read any of his other stuff, but the translation is really very smooth. It feels like they're trying to pitch it as also something that it's not quite. Like, I think it's smarter than
I think you're right. I think there's some marketing logic at play there, because famously, Attack on Titan.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Yeah. I think that one came from the Japanese end, though, just because of bad English. That happens sometime.
Yes, but I think that set an example that can then be repeated.
Yeah, sure.
And Attack on Titan, I mean, I actually wrote it down in my notes as an example of another book I enjoyed because of the emphasis on food. In this instance, the food was the people getting eaten by the Titans.
Right.
Who just mindlessly ate. And I remember those early volumes, I really loved it. I thought it was great. I mean, I really loved the concept. I loved the anime. I loved everything about it. And then the more and more I read, the more and more it got into this sort of political tract. And then this sort of, hey, maybe fascism isn't terrible. I started feeling, whoa.
Yeah.
What is this nonsense? And I don't believe that's what's going to happen with Dungeon Meshi. It feels more immediate. But I think they were on a similar track, which is the Attack on Titan is all about the right of these monsters to devour people. Mm-hmm. And it's this sort of idea of, you're in this environment where you're no longer the apex predator. That's a terrifying prospect. What does that mean when you either survive or you get eaten? What does that do? This is a very base human concern that we still have, this idea of, well, what could threaten me? And the Dungeon Meshi sort of flips that, but it's still that idea of we're in a food chain.
Yeah.
You know, and how do we relate to that?
Yes. And you can't like harvest too much of one thing because it'll affect other monsters in the chain.
Idea. Yeah. That's a brilliant little bit.
That comes up a few times, where it's like, well, we can't overfish this pond because the other creatures need to eat that, and then those creatures need to be eaten by other creatures, etc., etc. What did you make of the there's a taboo against eating demi-humans? Well, I should say it's not a complete taboo. It's mostly Chulchuk is like, hey, you can't eat things that have a human-looking face or think. And meanwhile, Leos is kind of like, well, maybe we should try eating this thing.
Yeah.
But also, Senshi at one point says, he says, like, it's eat or be eaten when they're fighting the Red Dragon down here. So it's almost, I really don't know where this was quite landing. Obviously, it's not vegetarianism in any way. I mean, they're eating all this stuff. Marcille would maybe swing vegetarian because she's quite disgusted by everything that they eat down here. It seems like Leos is maybe an omnivore, but is this thing about demi-humans... I mean, it's just, I'm not sure what my point is here. I think we're in a kind of fantasy realm.
I think you're talking about the limits of civility.
Yeah.
You know, that's where you need to draw a line somewhere. And this is what Chilchuk is of the party as a group. Chilchuk, I feel, is the one who's got the most instrumental reason. You know, he's got the world broken down into categories. He understands, well, this is us, and this is this, and my ability is to see the world in the context of traps and escape routes, and so I need to understand everything as being just so. That's how he interacts with the world. Whereas Leos has this compulsive aspect to his character. And him encountering our little barbarian friend, Senshi, I think that was a disastrous for everyone, because here's somebody who's enabling him. Like from the beginning, he had this book, and he was reading all these chapters about monsters in this book, and he's behaving like monsters to try and intimidate them. But I think he's trying to like live out this fantasy life in his head, this obsessive sort of interest he has in these monsters, behaving like them, studying them, and then consuming them. And I feel as if Chilchuk has gone like, well, but there has to be a line that we don't cross. And that sort of is where civility and civilization comes into conflict with, you know, its values out in the wild, you know. And the stories we tell about civilization is they went out and they encountered a threat and they eliminated the threat. We sanitize the language. We don't say they went out, they found a village of women and children from another tribe or another people, and they killed them all, and they took the land and they turned it into farmland. We don't say that. We say they dealt with the threat, or they removed the obstacle. We sanitize them. We use euphemisms. And I think like Chilchuk would be of that side of things. Like, you know, we need to hold the line. Whereas I think Leos would be all about it. He'd be like, yeah, let's go. let's eat some cherubs. I remember there was a panel in Alan Moore and Xander. There's one per episode. Alan Moore and Xander Cannon's Smacks.
Yeah. Where
we had stuffed cherubs.
Yeah.
I remember. And that was a whole, like, Robin got disgusted by that because like she didn't realize she was eating cherub. That's a sort of recurring idea. Like, never eat anything with a face. Like, is a pretty well-known expression.
Yeah. Well, that debate comes up in here. In that, I think it's specifically about the mermaids and mermen, because the mermaids look like humans, the mermen look like fish, mostly. And I think it's... Then Chilchuk's like, the rule is we can't eat demi-humans. But then the counter-argument from Leos is something like, well, what about, you know, cows or other things? They're as much living things as the demi-humans are. And it's not really pursued. And of course, as I said, the series isn't advocating for vegetarianism or anything. In fact, as I said, Senshi is the one that says it's eat or be eaten down here. Very literally. So it's just an interesting thing that's just kind of, at least in the first volume, just kind of left out there. It's something to think about.
It's at the heart of a lot of the fantasy genre as well. I when I was first reading the like Dungeon Master Guide, you know, D&D Dungeon Master Guide, I remember I was trying to find some information about a race. I thought it was a race, and I can't remember what they were now. But I was looking through the index, and I couldn't find it. And then I found it in the monsters section.
Right. Okay.
I was like, what?
Yeah.
But per the taxonomy of the Dungeon Master's Guide, they're monsters. So they're not really people.
Yeah.
Which again goes to a lot of what the fantasy genre does. The fantasy genre also obscures and elides the brutality of civilization, and that's a major facet of it. And I have seen people earnestly, like in all sincerity, compare Delicious in Dungeon to The Lord of the Rings. I have seen that.
Okay, in what way?
In the fact that they're both self-contained, self-sustaining fantasy worlds.
Right.
Tolkien also obsessively worked out all these different aspects to his story, including inventing the whole languages and a history and a genus and everything. But the other thing about Tolkien that was interesting is that he became obsessed with this question: do orcs have souls?
Okay.
That was a thing he struggled with.
Right.
He struggled with it.
Yes.
Because, as a Christian, his whole thing was, well, they have to have the choice to be evil.
Yeah.
Which means there could be a good orc.
Right.
Who didn't. Whereas if you read the book, the orcs are all personified as essentially evil and speak with working class British accents, which is a bit of class warfare going on here too.
Yeah. I think there was, even in Delicious in Dungeon, wasn't there a point in an early volume where they were, or am I confusing with something else, where there was a debate about whether people have souls or not? But in later volumes, it's 100% they do, because there's all sorts of logistics around resurrecting people, and it involves their souls and binding their souls and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I feel like she might have shifted in the direction of the plotting or her thoughts, or it's a translation.
She's challenging that idea potentially, because the orcs are a major element of Delicious Dungeons as well.
Yeah.
And how they're perceived by the people from the surface who are exploiting the dungeon to make money. I think that's the thing we've not really addressed, which is, why are adventurers going down to, they're bringing stuff up to sell.
Yes.
It's an economy. It's a black market economy that's underwriting the entire thing. And Laius is sort of a disruptor, if you like, because he's not coming back up to trade. He's just going further and further in.
Yeah. Yeah. And even when they finally get something that's worth a lot of money, they have no way to take it back. And he even describes at one stage how if you kill a dragon, there's not really a way to make a lot of money off of it, because of the logistics of all the people you have to bring down there to get to the dragon in the first place, and paying all those people, etc. And then by the time you've actually got that valuable... And also he says at one point, he says, some metals are worth more than dragons anyway, or something like that, so...
Yeah, he just says, just try and salvage some blood.
Yes.
Some blood, some saliva, things that might have some medicinal qualities or some sort of ingredient quality, That all makes perfect sense. Like, that's all, again, that's in-game logic.
Yes.
That makes sense.
It's all, yes. Yeah, it is very solid within this world. There's also there's a large kind of conspiratorial plot, which is only vaguely touched on in these first 4 volumes, but that lunatic wizard who set up this dungeon apparently has some sort of immortality spell, which some bigwigs above ground are hoping to get to. And I think that, is he hoping to kill the wizard and become the king of this? Does he mention that at some stage as well? To become king of the city?
Yeah, there is a idea that becomes more and more prevalent that one of the party is going to do that. I don't want to spoil anything, but there is this assumption that Laius is the main character, so therefore it would be him.
Right.
Okay. I will say that given that I have read the penultimate volume, it gets wild.
Okay.
It gets really wild. And it's very interesting what she does with the story. So yeah, you've got that to look forward to if you keep reading. I think you should. I think there's a lot here that you would.
Definitely. I will, because the like I said, the first 2 volumes I was like, I don't know if I could keep doing this for 14 volumes, but there was such a shift, and the pieces fit together so well, and there was really, I was surprised that she was going into detail about everything. And not like the jokey detail of the cooking, but like the detail of like the life cycle of mimics. That kind of thing was fascinating. It's just unexpected, I guess. I think strangely from the genre, that ran. I was not expecting there to be that much attention to things which have been delineated in other, like, I'm sure Dungeons & Dragons has their own version of what dragons are and all that stuff. And I just thought, she's not going to care about that kind of thing in here. And she does. She actually really goes into a lot of stuff and must have worked out a lot of it from page one. I think it fits so well together. But as I said, I think there has been some shift in plotting, I'm guessing, along the way. But that was interesting to me. And I definitely would keep reading it for that reason. And like, she's good at setting up the main plot, and then there's a subplot, and like I said, there's the plot about the immortality spell, which is just on the outskirts of it. So it's tantalizing. She knows how to set it up so you're reading along, and then this plot comes in, and this plot, and this plot, and you forget about this one, and then it comes back, and you're like, oh yeah, there's that whole thing going on. And we get a whole lot of stuff about the resurrection. I never expected any of that. I thought it was going to be very easy peasy, just resurrect people, because that's the way they kind of talk about it at the beginning, and that turns out to be not the case at all.
Yeah, there's that sort of impacts how these people are behaving.
Yeah,
this concern with life and death, and you can keep coming back to it, food, but that sort of. Because that's been introduced, then we learn more and more about these characters.
Yes.
And that's what I mean by factical world building. It all connects.
Yeah.
It's not just when you were reading out those titles at the start of this conversation, the Isekai titles, they sounded to me just like a Reddit fantasy board prompt.
Yeah.
You know,
they sound like joke titles.
the looseness of them. It's like, oh, tell me a story, and here's your prompt. You improvised. Whereas I think what's happening here is, no, this is all being worked out. This is all being defined, and then she's populating from within those limits and those, and then when you've established all that, what are the people like? Because they need to have opinions on this. Yeah. And then that's where your story comes from.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean. That's
and you learn that they're behaving in certain ways because of these rules, which we didn't know about beforehand. Yeah. The rules are introduced later, and you're like, oh, that's why this is happening this way. Yeah.
So world building has a bad reputation, because world building is assumed to mean, well, you set up your geography, you set up your history, you come up with some races, and then you just mash them all together, and then you assume you've got a story. People do that. That is a thing that happens.
Yeah.
But I think there has to be some sort of distinction, because this is world building which actually understands that the limitations are what give definition. Just as death gives definition and meaning to a person's life, the limitations give meaning to the fantasy.
Yes,
there needs to
100%.
be some sort of container that you work within. So in universe, the dungeon is a container. And the more the series progresses, we learn more about what that means and what the nature of that contained environment actually is. The nature of the magic that sustains it. And where all these creatures are coming from. And I think that's something that she's clearly worked out from the jump. And the plot is us navigating her understanding of what that means.
Yeah, yeah. One other point I wanted to make was that all of these isekai present a kind of European fantasy setting, and this does too, but almost maybe unconsciously, this is a Japanese fantasy setting, because in this case, especially with the foods, you've got the tempura and stuff like that. There's Japanese foods in here which are specifically had to come out of Japan. They couldn't have come from here. And even some things like Kenshi's name and the names of some characters are like, these are Japanese names.
Yeah. And some of the characters are styled as Asian characters as well. So, I mean, are you familiar with... so I just did a quick Google as we were talking, but are you familiar with Record of Lodoss War?
Yeah, vaguely, That's like from the 80s?
80s. Yeah. So there was a series of light novels, and then they had the anime based on it, and I believe there's also a game. There was a series of games. But the one I'd heard of was Sword World RPG, which was from 1989.
Okay.
And again, it actually is connected to Record of Lodoss War. There you go. So, but yeah, it is very much the Japanese response to D&D and Rune Quest and all those games from back in the day. So, I think if you play those games, or if you do look at those games, they would be sort of contending with the cultural dominance of the American version of a fantasy world, which has elves and dwarves and monsters and demons and so on. But these were Japanese story designers. So I've watched the Lodoss War anime, and there's a lot of like Asian sort of cultural aspects to it, because that's the audience for the anime. They're not necessarily eating, what's the French expression for the English, like steak and fries, pommes and frites. No, steak and chips. They call them steak and chips. They old French insult for English is steak and chips, because that's all they talk about. So that idea of European cuisine, that wasn't really there. It was Asian inflected, at least. So I think this isn't a new concept.
Right.
I think that sort of perspective on the dominant fantasy world has existed before. But
that's the thing. I think I see it all the time, but it's like another example, not food related. I was recently translating a series. Again, it's like a fantasy world, but they're going for training and like for martial arts training. And when they do their training, they sit in seiza, which is the Japanese kneeling position. So this is a Japanese thing, yet we're in some sort of European fantasy world where they wouldn't be sitting in that posture for martial arts training. Like that kind of stuff is slipping in there. Like I said, I don't know if it's consciously or unconsciously, but it's like, well, this is what we know, and this is how the martial arts training is. This is what the food is.
Well, I found it interesting that they had these live-action films based on Attack on Titan.
Yeah.
With Asian casts. Because they're Japanese movies. And I was like, well, no, Attack on Titan, they're all Germanic.
Yes, right.
They're all white people.
Right.
In fact, the one character who is Asian is notable for being the one surviving Asian character. So they should all be, they basically should look like the Hitler Youth. Yeah. Why did I not see it coming with Attack on Titan? Like, why did I not see it coming from like a mile away?
Yeah.
Oh, this theme song's getting my blood stirred. All these German lyrics. But I think I would compare it to something like Miyazaki, and how Miyazaki explores folklore and spirituality in his fantasy world. So like Spirited Away, The Boy and the Heron, which just came out recently, and I absolutely loved. I thought it was incredible. He's exploring like non-European.
Yes.
Sort of.
Yeah. So that's Spirited Away is like, that's a Japanese bathhouse, right? That this is taking place in. Here we're supposedly in like Gauntlet. We're like a European dungeon. But all this kind of Japanese stuff, in all of these series, Japanese stuff is happening just because it's accidentally slipping in there almost, So I did like that. But, another thing I liked was, especially early on, it was really like a parody of food manga. Because when they first meet Kenshi, the dwarf, and he tells them about some food, I think they kill a slime or something like that.
Yeah.
And he's like, here's how you have to dry it for 2 weeks. And then he pulls out this one. He's like, here's one I prepared earlier. This is like a cooking show. It is straight out of every cooking show where it's like you put the thing in the oven for 2 hours, and it's like he pulls it out and says, here's one I prepared earlier. And, that was a great little... There are great little touches like that in those bits, which, again, I enjoyed like more than the 10 panels of cooking or however much there were in like almost every chapter early on. Yeah. Okay, any other points we need to get to about this? I think we've kind of covered it. It's pretty unexpected is what I would describe. Now, how much does the anime cover?
Well, I only saw the first 2 episodes of the anime because I do not have Netflix. So I was at somebody else's house.
Okay.
So I don't have Netflix. I need to sort that out. But I thought it was remarkably faithful.
Okay.
And yes, they actually pronounced the main character's name, which I was very grateful for.
Does it like does it correspond like one chapter to one episode, or do you think they were covering more in the episodes?
It seemed pretty one-to-one.
Okay.
I felt like it seemed pretty one-to-one to me, given what I got to see. The recipes are there.
Mm-hmm.
You get the recipe shot,
yeah,
which I was very happy with. It was great to see that. And the dialogue flowed through. It was very reminiscent to me of what I'd read. Even though it's in Japanese, I haven't watched I never watched the dubbed version. So yeah, I think it was a very successful adaptation, and I haven't heard any concerns from the fans or like, oh, this is completely wrong. This is like M. Night Shyamalan doing Avatar. It's like, this is a disaster. Oh, that's American. That's American anime. That's not Japanese anime. I thought I made a quick short list of books this reminded me of.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That I could throw in the mix. Now, one that I was curious to maybe mention, but I haven't actually read. I've got it in the house. Drops of God.
Oh yeah, the wine manga.
Yeah, the wine manga. So I did wonder if I should read that, and just in terms of like, is it a similar peaks and troughs in terms of taste and experiencing taste?
I have a feeling we're gonna have like two. I think Delicious in Dungeon is gonna be a mashup. I think that's its angle. It's gonna be the dungeon manga and the food manga. So I think it's gonna be like Drops of God. I think if you read it, I haven't read it either, but my suspicion is it's all the same stuff, because like all the dungeon manga basically function the same way, and all the food manga basically functions the same way. So my guess is you'd see a lot of familiar stuff in it. Although I don't know if you'd have the stats. No, I think that. No, I don't know. Maybe.
It's also been adapted into a television show recently. So I think it's out there to watch if people are curious. So things this reminded me of. Linda Medley's Castle Waiting.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
In terms of some of the artistic style.
Yeah,
because Medley has this sort of manga influence herself.
Yeah.
But also this idea of a self-sustaining fantasy world in this community.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like there was some nods there.
Yeah.
I've already mentioned Ki Hayashida's Dorohedoro.
Yeah. I wouldn't have made that connection, but I kind of see it.
You see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I would maybe throw that to folks. Just what just occurred to me now, I just made sure I'd getting the name right, but Joan Safar and Louis Strundheim's Dungeon.
Oh, great series. You know what? That is a good comparison. I don't think they're similar, but I think in terms of the fun level,
interesting contrast.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the self-awareness of the genre.
Yes.
That they will call attention to, oh, well, this is a dungeon, and the hero is meant to do this, and you're meant to do this. And like, there's all these rules, and then the plot erupts from the fact that the character doesn't follow those rules.
That's a good comparison, yeah.
So throw that into the mix. I've been talking about Attack on Titan. But finally, a Western comic that I think does something like this. And again, I guess Dungeon by as far I've already mentioned, but English language, let's say, Western comic. Die, Kieran Gillen and Stephanie Hans.
I've never read it.
Right. So, I mean, again, that is very much written and created by somebody who's all about role-playing games. So the premise of Die is these characters, these teenagers are playing a role-playing game that their friend had designed as a dungeon master. And then through some hocus pocus nonsense, they actually were transported into the fantasy world.
Okay.
And then several of them came back. But one of them was missing. And they wouldn't tell anybody what happened. So as far as everyone else is concerned, did they murder him? Is this some sort of blood pact? Is this some sort of... But no, it turns out, like in the first issue, it's established that no, they're under a gas, that they actually cannot physically speak about what happened. And at the end of the first issue, they all get sucked back into the game, and it's an actual world. It's a game world, and their friend is the game master. Like he's actually there still, and he's now spinning this plot. And Delicious in Dungeon does something very similar.
Yeah.
So I would throw those into the mix. If people are familiar with those books, maybe I'd recommend Delicious in Dungeon. If you are listening to this and you yourself are a fan of Delicious in Dungeon, these are other things I'd point you to. Particularly, I can't believe I hadn't done my original list, but Svar and Trondheim's Dungeon.
Yeah,
that's just bloody brilliant.
Yeah.
Like, it's so good.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I think that's about covers it.
Yeah.
All right.
I will say I laughed out loud of the mention of a mithril kitchen knife.
Yes.
Actually,
yes.
that sums up.
That's very perfect.
That's the perfect metaphor for this entire melange.
Yeah.
A mithril kitchen knife.
Yeah, if you know what that means, then, or the word mithril means, or if that resonates with you in any way, then
I think that tells you everything you need to know about this.
Exactly. Okay.
Delicious in Dungeon by Ryoko Kui is published by Yen Press. If you're enjoying this podcast, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics, and go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on X, Facebook, or YouTube. Via our site, you can also shop on Amazon to support the show and find links to subscribe to the podcast. You can comment on any episode there or drop us a line at mail@deconstructingcomics.com. Are you making a comic? Send it to us and we'll do a Critiquing Comics episode about it. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. In the show notes, you'll find a link to our listener survey. We'd really appreciate it if you could take 5 to 10 minutes to give us your opinions of this podcast. Next week, in a flashback episode from 2021, Kumar and I dig into the first 17 issues of Christopher Priest's run on Black Panther. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.